Hello, and welcome to Integrating Hospitals into the Larger Mass Violence Response. This is a webinar that is being put on by the ICPTTA program. There are three of us presenting today. My name is Tara Hughes, and I am the director of the ICPTTA program. I have a 35-year history of as a trauma therapist and have been working in mass violence response in both the mental health realm, victim services realm, and the emergency management realm for the last 15 years. So I'm going to ask Carol to introduce herself now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Walton. I'm very happy to be here today to get to discuss this important issue with you. I've been working in emergency management for about 16 years. During that time, I have worked with the state emergency management agency, with public health, and in higher ed. I am also a consultant for ICPTTA.
And now Karina will introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Karina Soleil Brito, and I am a public health preparedness consultant with ICF. I have had the honor of working with first responders and emergency medical professionals in public health for nearly 30 years.
Excellent. Thank you. We are really excited to have these guys join in this training and be able to talk with you guys about the importance of really integrating hospitals into the larger mass violence response when something happens, whether it's mass violence on a local level or a national level, domestic terrorism, hate crimes, those kinds of things. So we're going to start by talking about the fact that according to one source, and this is Reuters who was reporting this, nearly 200 people, 2,000 people have been killed or injured in instances of mass violence since 1999. To know that this is one source of this information, and there's a couple of things to know about that, which we'll talk about throughout the entirety of our talk today. One is that the definition of what mass violence is changes depending on who you're talking to, that it is different for the FBI and Office for Victims of Crime sometimes than it is for local law enforcement, and sometimes in the healthcare field, there's a focus more on mass casualty because you are seeing the casualties, the injuries, and the deaths that are coming in, and not necessarily thinking about the violence that created that or what created that. So thinking about this is one representation of mass violence. It's one definition of mass violence. And again, that can change depending on who you're talking to. What that means is that there are different numbers that you will find in pretty much every report that you see about mass violence. This one, Reuters, is a pretty reputable source and is nonpartisan in many ways. So really just looking at numbers and looking at what injuries and deaths have been caused in mass shootings in particular. So again, this doesn't include bombings or other things like that, which is also something to remember as we move forward, that there are lots of people impacted in lots of different ways by lots of different things. The program that we're representing today is the ICPTTA program, and we are really looking at using expertise from people who have been on the ground to help communities as a whole prepare for and plan to respond to the victims of mass violence and domestic terrorism. Hospital systems are a key stakeholder in that, in all communities, and they need to be linked in a vital way into the larger response. So we're really looking at helping the entire community figure out how to care for victims after a criminal event. So we are talking today about mass violence. What you will be able to do is think about it as mass casualty in general. So if it is something that is caused by a hurricane or a tornado or mudslide or whatever that happens to be, much of this is going to be very similar. But we are talking about mass violence today in particular. Hospital systems have a number of ways that they are intimately involved in these responses. First one is that they are going to see injuries and deaths. They're going to come through their systems. And so making sure that process is linked to a larger process that gets needs met after the fact. So hospital systems meeting medical needs is one vital aspect of these responses, but really looking at how do we really integrate the victim care needs. So looking at what does it mean to be a victim of a crime and how does that change something for both victims and first responders? What does it mean about what services are available in the community? And what does it mean in terms of long term how this is going to impact the community. So this program looks at all of that and helps to create a plan that incorporates all of that, incorporates hospitals into the system, incorporates schools into the larger system, all of that. We do that through individualized training and technical assistance for communities where we have consultants who will help those communities figure out what's needed in their community, what's going to work in their community, and use that information to actually write their plan. We do that based around what we call the 16 best practices of planning for criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism. That's what that CMV/DT stands for. And these are 6 best practices in planning that have come from experience. Again, we go back to the subject matter experts who work in our program and who have done this, been on the ground, and really pulling from them what is needed in terms of planning so that things work well when we get there. I am a veteran of 23 mass violence responses, and I can tell you that one of the commonalities is that when I arrive, whether that is 2 hours after something starts, 2 days after, 2 weeks after, that there's often still a level of chaos that is underneath everything that's happening. And part of that is that people don't know each other, organizations don't know each other, they don't know what's out there. So our program is really about pulling that all together and getting people to know each other beforehand. So you'll see 3 of these best practices that are highlighted. For hospitals, we're really looking at where they are going to be integrally connected. And one of those places is the Family and Friends Reception and Notification Center. So this is an original, immediate place where people go to get information, including information about where their loved one might be, whether their loved one is deceased or perhaps injured. And the idea is to have a central place where that can happen so that people don't feel the need to jump from hospital to hospital in the community, which is often what we see happen. Victim identification and notification protocols are a second component of that, go hand in hand with that, where it's really about identifying victims. And sometimes that can get very complicated and needs to use disaster mortuary teams, DMORT teams, or the medical examiner, the coroners have to get a lot of information from families in order to be able to do victim identification, those kinds of things. And then the final place where it's really integrated, needs to be integrated, is the Family and Friends Assistance Center. And most hospitals have their own Family Assistance Center plans internal to their hospital. What we're going to talk about today is how important it is to really pull that function out of the hospital at a certain point so that everybody who you're serving medically in your hospital is getting access to everything else that's out there, including information about the event. So this is kind of laying the groundwork, both what our program does, but a lot of what we're going to do today. And then specifically, what is it about this course? Why is this here? Why are we doing this for you? If you haven't already responded in some way to a mass violence incident, you've probably taken part in some kind of planning or an exercise or at least discussions within your healthcare system. And what this is going to do is reinforce your plans internally, but also help you again see how to connect that to the outside mass violence response, and that community plans are a part of this that hospitals need to be very connected to. We're going to look at family assistance centers. How are they defined? What are they supposed to do? And why and when you should think about shifting from an internal family assistance center within your hospital system to an external system for those victims and the families. We're going to look at challenges and we're going to look at what's ideal. So, challenges coming from experiences that we've had, that we've heard about, those kinds of things. The ideal, really looking at after action reports and what we know could have been helpful in all of those responses. And then really looking at how does that morph into good planning, and what relationships do you need to have? What are the key players that need to be a part of this planning process, so that when things happen, in an event of something awful happening, those relationships are already there. The planning is already there. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Karina, and she's going to start us out, sort of ground us in a scenario so that we can use that throughout the discussion today.
Thanks. It's a warm summer day and your town is hosting its annual street festival, attended by people from all over the region. You're working in the local hospital, getting ready to finish your shift and meet your family at the event when you hear the call. An unknown number of people have been shot at the festival and the shooter has not been apprehended. Within minutes, people of all ages and in all conditions will arrive to your hospital. Some will be in shock but not injured. Others will be critically injured and dropped off by someone else. Children will be separated from parents. Patients may not have ID, and some may be unconscious and untriaged. As the news spreads, people will begin to arrive looking for their loved ones. The phones are ringing nonstop, and your waiting area is crowded and very loud. It's getting difficult to separate the injured from the worried well, from the concerned, and now the press. Mass casualty incidents have ripple effects that impact victims, survivors, loved ones, local communities, and the psyche of our nation. What happens in the acute phase, when people are trying to determine whether their loved ones were hurt or worse, has the potential to affect those effects. Regardless of your role, whether you're in emergency management, a member of the pre-assigned family assistance branch, or the charge nurse in the emergency department, your goal is the same: triage patients and bring your emergency room and the rest of the hospital back to whatever normal looks like for you. Before we continue, let's review some terms. These are often used interchangeably, so it's important to note the differences. Hospital family information or support centers are set up on site after a critical incident. Hospital staff provide initial information to loved ones and help with reunification. Family reception or reunification centers are temporarily, usually off-site locations that fall under the responsibility of the jurisdiction. So you're likely familiar with those two centers and understand the pressure that they can add to an already chaotic hospital response. In this module, we will highlight the benefits of working with community stakeholders to plan for and establish a community family assistance center, a nearby space where people can find information about their loved one's status and receive various types of assistance with mental health, spiritual care, and other short and long-term needs geared towards victims of crime. Moving these services off-site can ultimately free hospital staff and space to ensure a safe, organized recovery. The Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act of 1996 required that the National Transportation Safety Board coordinate federal, state, local, and volunteer services. NTSB's Transportation Disaster Assistance Division, or TDA, was and still is required to work with air or rail carriers after major incidents to establish family assistance centers where survivors and loved ones can meet. Healthcare is built upon this model, and many facilities across the country have plans to establish a family information center on campus. So wait, you're thinking, okay, we already have a plan for our healthcare facility that's compliant with the Joint Commission and the emergency preparedness rule. We've already done a mass casualty incident tabletop. We're done, right? You might have a plan for your on-campus family information center, but you're only halfway there. Think back to this scenario: the overcrowding, the confusion, the noise, the patient surge. loved ones, press, police. Let's talk about the benefits of having a community family assistance center. So, what are some of the benefits? Community family assistance centers provide a secure space for loved ones to more easily keep up with information about the incident. Local or federal law enforcement and other leaders can provide regular updates, including status of the suspect, evidence, and other related information. In a larger area with assigned spaces, more resources can be made available outside of the hospital. So loved ones and victims who are released from the hospital can also get help with locating or recreating identification, reunifying children with legal guardians, and legal or other victim assistance resources. After a critical incident, being with others who are experiencing similar trauma can be very powerful and healing. A community family assistance center can provide space and mental health support for this type of experience. Now, we all know the sooner you move people out of the hospital, the sooner you can shut down the family assistance branch and return staff to their more traditional duties. You'll save time and other precious resources while taking comfort in knowing that people are getting the help they need.
So before we shift, I'm actually going to break in here. This is Tara again, and talk about two things that that Karina just said that I think are really, really important. The first one is that the regular updates. Information is like handing someone gold in these kind of incidences, where they don't know what's happening with their loved one, but they also don't know what's happening on a larger scale. And they're really looking to know what's happening on a larger scale. So figuring out what's the most effective and efficient way to get information to people. You may be able to give information that you have gotten as a hospital to the people who are in your hospital, but linking them to the overall briefings that are happening is much more effective, and it generally gets them more information than what you already know. And I think the other piece that is really, really important is the idea of people being together with others who have gone through similar things. Although it wasn't a hospital, after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary, the families all went home to their homes, and they had guards at their homes, and they spent time there. There was an isolation that happened because of that. That was broken when the president came. It was President Obama, and he came. The shooting happened Friday morning. He came Sunday afternoon, and the families had the opportunity to be brought together on Sunday afternoon. And as a witness to that, watching mothers of 6 and 7-year-olds who had died be able to look across the room and see another mother of a 6 or 7-year-old who had died, and being able to talk to that person, excuse me. Being able to not talk to that person and just hug that person and know that all of a sudden there's somebody there who gets it on a level that nobody else is getting it. It's mother to mother, father to father, parent to parent, whatever it was. But that idea of getting people together and allowing them to be in that space is really important in terms of their ability to start to figure out, how do I manage this? How do I deal with this? And how do I move on? So I just wanted to throw those things in there.
Thank you, Karina and Tara. That was very wonderful information that you just shared, very beneficial to everyone. The next few slides that we're going to look at are going to focus on the top 10 challenges faced by hospitals during mass violence incidents and some strategies for overcoming these challenges. We've broken these down into 3 categories. We're going to look at clinical challenges, communication challenges, and organizational challenges. While these will not be an exhaustive list of everything that might occur, you will find some more resources that we'll provide at the end of this presentation that hopefully will help you tailor your planning and response efforts. The first thing that we're going to look at are our clinical challenges. While hospitals are certainly accustomed to facing many challenges such as patient surge, rapid transfer of patients based on injury types, an increased need for blood and supplies, and possibly even emergency credentialing of personnel that have been brought in through mutual aid, through Medical Reserve Corps or through the Emergency System for Advanced Registration of Volunteer Health Professionals, or ESER-VIP, incidents of mass violence compound daily operational challenges by adding some additional complications. The first category of challenge that we will be covering today is this clinical challenge, and we want to begin by looking at overcrowding. While patient surge is addressed in hospital plans and you exercise this on a regular basis, mass violent incidents not only lead to patient surge, but a significant number of family members, friends, community leaders, media, and even law enforcement personnel who will also come to the facility because they're all looking for information. Not only will emergency departments and hospital rooms be impacted by this surge, but your parking lots, your waiting rooms, the chapel, cafeterias, and restrooms will also be overcrowded and noisy, which will create confusion and challenges to communication. Second, victims of mass violence may arrive at the hospital by unconventional transportation methods. You may see that patients arrive or victims arrive in pickup trucks and personal automobiles. They may come by Uber or Lyft or by taxis. You may even have some that just walk in. And what this means for you is these patients will not be triaged. So this will add another burden to the hospital. Next, patients won't always arrive with identification or with someone who could provide medical information to the healthcare providers. So this not only adds risk to medical treatments, but it can also affect the amount of time it takes to reunite these patients with their loved ones.
So before we move to the next slide, this is Tara again. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the Las Vegas Route 91 Harvest Festival in terms of these clinical challenges, and really highlight a couple. One is, as Carol was talking about the first challenge of overcrowding, that concert at that time had approximately 18,000 people in attendance. So you think about 18,000 people who may walk through your door because they're directly impacted, plus all of the people who are looking for them. And so that's where, when we talk about overcrowding, we're not talking about sort of a small crush that you may have done a drill about or something like that, but we are talking massive amounts of people who may show up and create chaos. And you'll hear me say, you've heard it a few times already, chaos is the word that keeps coming up, and that's what we hear from hospitals after this. Yes, you guys get it under control very quickly, but there are moments and levels of chaos that are much larger than in other places. The other thing that Carol talked about was the lack of identification. The vast majority of people, when something happens at an event like this, or really anywhere, is they drop everything they have. So if I am a female or male and I have a purse, a backpack, something, and I drop it, my identification is likely to be in there. So I may walk into you without identification. I may also be brought into you unconscious without that identification. So when you look at the amount of time and the amount of complication about that, what that lack of identification can do, it's really something to remember in terms of wanting to plan for that or think about how you might deal with that. So I'll hand it back to Carol.
Thank you, Tara. Historically speaking, communications is often listed as one of those top challenges during and after a mass violent incident or any other large-scale disaster. We just tend to have issues with communication. First, incidents of mass violence are going to draw large media coverage. This creates a couple of related challenges for a hospital. First, the hospital needs to protect its patients and their loved ones from the intrusion of the media. And next, the media also needs information and a place to set up so that they're not inclined to just wander around the facility searching for this information, because we all know they want the most current information to release. Next, people want and need information about their loved ones and the incident as it unfolds because things are constantly changing. Your hospital will be receiving phone calls and emails with requests for information, and you may not be able to handle that kind of surge in addition to your patient surge. External communication will be strained as everyone is working to gather information about the incident and the victims. But it's going to be critical for you to remember that hospital staff, law enforcement, and local community leaders need to be provided regular briefings and be able to provide briefings to the loved ones because they're all interested in what's going on. Internally, your staff will also be stressed. They're working long hours and they're unsure about the incident, about the suspects, and additional details that may be unfolding as we move throughout this incident. They'll also benefit from updates to reassure them of their safety and to maintain their mental health and resilience. Because again, we don't always know who is involved in the attack. So safety and those concerns are a big issue. While your hospital has likely activated some form of incident command, someone really does need to be responsible to serve as a liaison and keep people updated on a regular basis. And that will be both internally and externally. The next category of challenges really can affect the organizational response to a mass violence incident. Because of the need to conduct criminal investigations, federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies will be present to collect information from patients as soon as it's permissible. This may disrupt or even impede patient care if we're not prepared for that. The possibility of a second attack, particularly on a place where many people are congregating, which will now be your facility, is also another organizational challenge. The need for hospital security to protect those hospital staff, the patients, family, and friends is very real, and adjusting your security policies and your ingress and egress routes should be part of your plan. During an incident of mass violence, hospital staff and medical professionals will face a situation that really does tax them and will use all of their strength to make it through this. They'll work long hours, and many will make sacrifices so that they can respond to the incident. So it's also good to keep in mind that providing behavioral health support and helping healthcare workers stay as resilient as possible will present another challenge for you. While hospitals frequently conduct exercises and drills with external partners, victim service partners are often not included in those activities because we're often just doing patient surge or maybe pediatric surge, not something that would get to the level of including our victim service partners. So the challenge of working with people who you haven't met before or networked with in the past, such as these victim service organizations, can create another challenge for you. And finally, knowing when to transition from that hospital, family and friends assistance center or FAC to that community FAC that Karina talked about can be a challenge for you, particularly in cases where you have not addressed that in your plan. As hospitals move into recovery, they're going to want to close their family and friends assistance center and transition the patients, families, and friends to the community FAC to get the information that was being provided through that assistance center. Remember, the goal is to keep people from feeling like they're being handed off to another agency or organization during this transition, but also to remember that community family assistance center is often better suited to address a wide variety of needs. Some of the challenges that we mentioned earlier in the clinical slides can also affect your organization. For example, if patients are unable to communicate and need to be identified, hospitals may have to set up a place for that. It set aside staff to gather descriptions of loved ones. You may even have to photograph unique characteristics and different things like that that can be used to assist in that identification. One of the other things we mentioned was local hospitals may run out of blood and other supplies and need to request blood donations from the public and supplies from other healthcare facilities. Other hospital components such as the pharmacy, the lab, environmental services, and even the spiritual care may become overwhelmed. And let's not forget, we've mentioned it several times, but there's still a continued need to manage the media presence that's going to be there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carol. And I think that the, sort of laying out what are the challenges is a really important way to start, because I think those challenges really lay the groundwork for how do we best serve everybody in the community that needs to be served. One of the things that you see on your screen right now is actually from the NTSB. Earlier, we talked about how family assistance centers, family and friends assistance centers really came from the work of the NTSB and the Disaster Aviation Act of 1996. And what we know from this, the time that's happened from 1996 all the way through now is that there are things that are very common in family assistance centers that really have been documented all along by the NTSB. And they've been incorporating lessons learned throughout the years as they respond to transportation incidents, but they work well sort of across the board. So when we look at the chart that you have in front of you right now, and you look at what are the fundamental concerns of family members, notification if someone is involved is key. That's the first thing. The second thing is, where is my loved one? So we want to know, is someone involved? We want to know where they are. And then we want access to resource and information. That can vary depending on what the needs are. And that varies depending on whether it's a crime or not. So in the case of what we're talking about being a crime, yes, people want to know, was my loved one involved? And they will search high and low. If they walk to your front door and you can't give them that information, they may get in their car and drive to another healthcare setting to see if their loved one is there or if they can get that information. And so that complicates life. If it's a crime, it complicates it even further. In some cases, if you have family and friends who are also witnesses to what happened. And so now you have people who are potential witnesses who are trying to find information and seeking it out themselves, and therefore becoming less accessible to law enforcement as they are trying to get information, those kinds of things. The other thing that can happen if people are going from point A to point B to point C to point D in terms of where is my loved one is that they are harder to find. If we find their loved one, they're harder to find. How do we get a hold of them? Who has their phone number? Who is their next of kin? And how do we get them that information? So those first two, notification of involvement and victim accounting, where are people and were they involved? Really, really important to get to everybody, to the people who are involved, the family members and the friends, but also to the community. If you have a centralized place where that information is being held, then you have the ability to reduce that chaos again. And that's where that resource and information stuff comes into play. So yes, you're going to have information, or you're going to have resources of counseling, of support, of incident support, those kinds of things. You're going to also be able to get information from these places. And again, your hospital will be getting some information, and your public information officer will be linked in probably to the overall response. But the information, if we can link people much more closer to that information, and there's maybe a joint information center that's been set up, and there's a briefing that happens out of there, linking your folks who have people in your hospital to that centralized place for information can be really helpful, both to you and to those families. There are a lot of other things that they may be able to get there: financial assistance, travel assistance, lodging assistance, legal rights, those kinds of things may also be there. The other thing that a family assistance center does in the community is generally that is where people are going to have to go to get their belongings back, their personal effects back. They may not be able to get all of them back. There are some, because we're talking about a crime, that will end up being part of the crime scene and people won't be able to get them back. But a lot of things people can get returned to them. And most communities need to figure out if there is how to activate a company that will catalog personal effects and orchestrate getting them back to people. If it is a federal crime or a hate crime, domestic terrorism, those kinds of things, generally the FBI does this. It can be an incredibly large activity. Excuse me. It can take a long time. In Las Vegas, that was the largest number of personal effects ever cataloged in the country, with an attempt to give them back. And it took the FBI a little over a week to get them fully cataloged so that people could then start to retrieve what they were able to retrieve. That is going to be done at a much not at your hospital, but at a centralized family assistance center. So thinking about what are the concerns of families and trying to streamline how do we get these concerns met is really important. So when you look at those concerns and you think about the needs, it's a need for information. It's a need for information about the response, what's available, what are services that are available. It's investigative information. And then that last bullet up there, feeling like they're connected to each other. I may not know other people who were directly impacted by this, but if I am sitting in a room, there is a camaraderie and a support that comes out of being together. So if we have families that have been directly impacted who are either in their separate homes or in separate hospitals, they don't get the benefit of all being together and having that connection. And that's one of the really big things that a community family and friends assistance center can do. We're going to move into now the ideal. What are we looking for in terms of, we have the top 10 challenges. Now, what are the top 10 ideals that in terms of planning that we can put into place? And we want those overall to be trauma-informed, victim-centered, and collaborative. The only way that that is going to happen is with pre-planning. So I am going to hand this off again to Karina, and she is going to talk about the ideal, sort of what are we really looking for in terms of a plan and a response.
Thanks. In a perfect world, hospitals would have a centralized patient accounting system with information on victims and patients. Each hospital would conduct an initial check-in of family members and the patient or patients they are looking for. And this would include contact information for the family and identifying characteristics of the patient, such as hair color, skin color, tattoos, clothing, jewelry, etc. Sometimes family members also discover that their loved one didn't have a means to communicate or went to a location other than their home or the hospital. It's important to plan for how to determine a loved one's relationship to the patient or victim, as many loved ones who will be seeking information may not actually be family or considered next of kin. Hospitals should also have plans to address unaccompanied minors after mass casualty incidents. Some of the considerations related to that include children could present with patients or unaccompanied as patients. A supervised pediatric safe area should also be designated in a perfect world. This area should ideally be separate from the command type area where children could hear unsettling information. Hospitals should also ensure that there's a process for checking children out to an appropriate caregiver. Adding incident briefing to existing internal and hospital daily meetings and communications can help healthcare workers plan for their shifts. Hospitals should also provide timely patient lists and access to the electronic health records to that centralized patient accounting system. It's important to ensure that a hospital representative has access to that accounting system and to the information system. The system should also be accessed or be able to be accessed on behalf of families and loved ones from a non-hospital location, such as the Community Family Assistance Center. We just need to ensure the system includes a coordinated process for reconciling unidentified patients that aligns with all area hospitals, local law enforcement, and the medical examiner or coroner. Over the past year, we know that many hospitals have bolstered their telehealth and virtual capabilities. Maximizing those after an incident can ensure that loved ones who are unable to be on the scene can also stay informed. It can also help patients who are released continue to receive virtual medical care as needed. And finally, many hospitals across the country have had to manage patient surges during COVID-19. This clarified the role of healthcare coalitions, streamlined patient transfers, and that sort of thing. It's important to incorporate those lessons that you've learned into mass casualty incident plans as soon as practical. Now we'll talk about the ideal when it comes to clinical death notifications. Every state has a law that determines who can give a death notifications. Typically includes law enforcement, medical examiners, and coroners. Ideally, these professionals will be trained to, 1, take into account cultural and religious sensitivities, 2, communicate with loved ones who may have access and functional needs or disabilities, and 3, refer loved ones to victim advocates in mental health or spiritual care and chaplaincy professionals. After a mass casualty incident, it's important for hospitals to set aside a private area that can accommodate the size of the group, allowing for at least 10 loved ones.
So I'm just going to jump in here and say that death notifications and after actions from most of the large events that have happened over within the country over the last, I would say, 10, maybe 15 years. This is something we hear from victims and families well after the event has happened, that the death notifications were not handled well, that they were done by people who did not have the appropriate training, that there was no support given immediately afterwards, that there were so many, many trained professionals, the coroners, the law enforcement, the staff at a medical examiner's office. They are trained to do this, but if they are handling thousands or hundreds of death notifications, the amount of time and patience that they can give to the people they're giving death notifications to is cut. It's shorter. And so people remember that. So thinking about how do we maximize the ability to give good death notifications is something that we really want you to think about planning and becoming integral in. How do we make this so that when people think about it after the fact, this is not a point that they remember necessarily. If a death notification is done well, it's great. If it is not done well, it can really leave lasting impressions. So thinking about how are we going to do this and where within your hospital and or should any of them be happening in your hospital, and if they should, who should be doing them, those kinds of things. It's all important to remember. So I'll hand it back now. Carol, I believe.
Thank you. So let's talk about communications again. We talked quite a bit about it earlier, and let's circle back to it now and include that in some of the ways that we can have an ideal situation. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is ideally the hospital public information officer will coordinate with that community family assistance center once that's been activated, and to the Joint Information Center if that section has been activated. And to give you a little bit more information, your Community Family Assistance Center, PIO, should be able to provide you with specific criteria and details on how they want that communication to flow, because depending upon the situation, they may have different elements activated. Remember, we also talked about the fact that victims, patients, families, their friends, they're all going to need and want to have access to regularly updated information about the incident. So ideally, again, there will be some scheduled briefings that will provide them with some timely updates. Hopefully, and this does often happen, these updates will be provided by the Community Family Assistance Center. So, what that means for hospitals is that ideally you would support the families and the patients that are still in your facility by providing a space for them to get together and call into those Community Family Assistance Center briefings. This will allow you to increase their opportunity for peer support between the families, much like Tara talked about earlier on. Sorry. Ideally, you'll also have planned to support non-residents and foreign nationals who may be victims of whatever mass violent incident has taken place. Those victims may also have family members there as well. So if you have identified interpreters during your planning process, this will help ensure that you have those folks available to assist during an incident. Also, be prepared to provide access to telephones, outlets for folks to plug in and charge their phones, phone chargers, and internet or Wi-Fi access as much as practical. Families are again going to want to communicate with others outside of the hospital, and they will request these items from you. So it will make it much easier if you have planned for that during your planning process. Now, I know I've talked about providing internet access, but you also may need to plan to monitor and possibly even limit that internet access just to make sure your system is not overwhelmed. You also may need to be prepared to possibly provide minimal financial support to purchase necessities such as those phone chargers that we talked about earlier if they're needed. Orlando Health's white paper on supporting non-resident and foreign citizen patients can help healthcare facility emergency planners plan for and better support patients in general after a mass casualty incident. So that might be something that you would like to look at in the future.
And before we move on, I just want to point out that a lot of what Carol was just talking about in terms of services like phone chargers and things like that, there are times where the Community Family and Friends Assistance Center has made contact with companies that will help with those things. So that's another reason to really be linked into the bigger system. In some transportation incidents, certain cell phone companies have stepped up and actually increased people's minutes per month so that they don't go over that and get charged, or give people a phone so that they can reach out to as many people as they want and not have to think about that. So thinking about what might be available in the larger response is also can be really helpful. And that includes, some of the other things that Carol was talking about in terms of non-resident and foreign nationals. It is very likely that if there are known foreign nationals involved in the incident, that the State Department and or the American Red Cross may be in contact with the consulates and may have already created those linkages. So you might not have to do that. You might just have to get the person to the Family Assistance Center. So thinking about from the perspective of what's needed, that some of that might actually be available at the Family Assistance Center in the community already. Back to you, Carol.
Thank you, Tara. Now let's look at an ideal organizational structure and some other information. Ideally, your organizational structure will include a branch within your hospital incident command system that handles family support. Based on the increased amount of family support needed in an incident of mass violence, it's really going to be important that you have included this branch in your plans. If you have identified branch members who can fill those roles, you've trained them on the procedures and included them in exercises prior to an event, this will certainly increase the effectiveness of the branch during a real incident. It will also be very beneficial to understand the mechanism that initiates the opening of the Community Family Assistance Center so that we can be looking at that transition from the hospital Family Assistance Center to that community FAC. For several jurisdictions, the emergency management may be the agency that's responsible for this. But if you've met with members in the victim services providers prior to an incident during your planning process, hopefully you will learn what element does actually take responsibility for that. The Family Assistance Center facilitates access to advocates and some other forms of support that hospitals don't have. So ideally, the hospital will provide access to the victims and their family members for those advocates, even while the Family Assistance Center is housed within the hospital. And you will coordinate any logistical needs that come up for families to help access that Community Family Assistance Center. You really need to know when you and your facility are ready to link into that bigger system so that you can hand the reins over to them. One way to do this is to identify touch points in your plan. These are spots where the hospital will shift the family and victim support for those non-medical issues over to that community FAC once it has been opened. The community FACs can provide access to several additional support resources that we mentioned earlier, and I'd like to give you a few examples of those. They can provide transportation assistance, such as flying loved ones in to sit with the patient that you might have in your hospital. They can provide lodging by securing a hotel room for those loved ones. They can provide legal guidance, such as parent custody issues, undocumented patients, orphaned children, estate issues, and they can provide vital identification information such as property transfer and identification for travel. So you can see that they have a lot of options to assist that you may not want to take on in a hospital.
I think the one other thing that I would add to that is, and I meant to do this at the beginning and I apologize, but we've been using the term victim throughout this webinar, and just for everyone to know that we're using the legal definition of victim when we're talking about victims. So we're talking about people who, according to law enforcement and prosecutors, would be considered a victim of this crime. And why do we do that? We do that because we are really looking at the care of those victims in the immediate aftermath and then ultimately the longer aftermath. And one of the ways that we in this country take care of victims or try to take care of victims is through victim advocates and victim compensation. So victim advocates are trained to spend years linking people who are a victim of a crime to resources. That starts at the families and the Community Family Assistance Center. If it is a crime, if it's terrorism, if it's mass violence crime of any dimension, there will be victim advocates there. And those victim advocates will also be able to sign people up for victim compensation. And victim compensation is actually a state program. Each state has a different program, but those programs are set up to meet the basic needs of crime victims. So it may be that they're able to, if they don't have health insurance, they can get medical bills paid, they can get co-pays paid, they can get mental health treatment paid for, they can get lost wages in some cases. It varies depending on state. But one of the things that you're going to find at a community family and friends family and friends assistance center is that victim advocates and victim compensation advocates will be there so that you can get people signed up and they can get moving in that direction and get their needs met with as little financial burden as possible. So back to you, Carol.
Thank you, Tara. And let's not forget about the organizational staff. We've talked a lot about victims, patients, families, and friends, but let's not forget about your staff. So let's take just a moment to discuss providing that ideal situation for them. let's face it, there's going to be compelling physical and emotional stress that will be experienced by the staff, by first responders who work as part of this mass violence incident operations. So healthcare entities really should proactively plan for those staff and support an employee health and well-being unit leader position in your hospital incident command system if possible. Um, and it's tempting to want to bring in all of our staff on day one. So let's also look at that for just a minute because we've talked about early on some of the challenges that we have identified are that people may not be triaged when they come in. They may come in by unconventional methods. They may come in without identification. So there is a high likelihood that a mass violent incident will bleed into more than one day. So if you've brought in all of your staff on that first day, you have no reserve staff left to backfill them on that second day. So remember that things that you have planned for in the planning process tend to be to work better in real world events. So as you're preparing plans for this, let's remember to try to reserve some of your staff back for that second day. Next, let's think about providing mental health and/or resiliency support for your staff. You can start demobilization support on day one of the incident. You might also consider making crisis counselors available for individual sessions 24 hours a day for 10 days or so, because you'll have staff that will work different shifts. So you don't want it to just be a 9 to 5 situation. You want all the staff to be able to access that, and also tap into existing behavioral health supports and employee assistant program supports that you may have. And finally, I'd like to mention that it may be very important for you to establish a badging or security process for your staff to protect your site and the staff from all that unwanted media attention that we've talked about earlier.
Great, thank you. So now let's talk about what does this mean for planning and relationships. We've talked a lot about what the challenges are and what the ideal is. That ideal is only created if planning has been put into place. So we're hoping that this is going to lead you to planning, and again, not just planning internal to your healthcare system, but how do you link that healthcare system to the larger response that is going on. And why we're doing that is because it is never a good idea to meet someone in the middle of a crisis who you have to work with. So meeting people during planning is really important. Identifying shortfalls prior to an incident. So you talk to people and you realize, oh, we've never thought about that. Or you run an exercise or a training and you realize that there's a piece that didn't work, that you hadn't thought about a certain piece. So you get to do that ahead of time. Part of the benefit of this type of planning at a community level is that it really bolsters the opportunity for community resilience as a whole. If you are talking about this stuff well in advance, that means that even if you don't have every piece of it figured out 100% by the time something happens, that you have the conversations are already moving and people are already thinking, and people know resources and they know how to link things together. And so the entire community becomes a more resilient place. So doing things ahead of time to plan and build relationships is really what we're talking about here. So this is the same slide we had at the beginning, but we're just going to review sort of what we did in this training. We looked at really the differences between hospital plans and community plans for mass violence. And we really, I highlighted the fact that there are different kinds of family assistance center. And when it is a mass violence response or mass casualty response of any dimension, it's really important to link the people who are in your healthcare system to the larger response for lots of reasons. So we identified challenges, we identified the ideal, and now we're really looking at planning and relationships. So, in terms of planning and relationships, ICPTTA, the program, has a couple of ways that we can make that happen. One is if you want additional information or you think what you've heard today is good information, but you want to figure out how do you customize it to your community, just specifically about your healthcare linkage into the larger response. Contacting ICPTTA at icptta@icf.com or the phone number that's listed on your screen will link you with us, and we can have one of our presenters today or another subject matter expert connect with you and really talk through how do you customize what you learned today? How do you take the ideals that we've identified and create a system that will link your healthcare system into the larger response system? So we can do that. The other option is that we have what are known as training and technical assistance sites, TTA sites, and a community can identify itself through an application process that they want to look at all of those 16 best practices. So we really focused on those 3 that were highlighted at the beginning, but we can come to your community and talk about all 16 of them and help you write the plan so that it incorporates the victim care stuff, help to write an annex to your existing plan, whatever that might look like. So what you have on your screen right now, on the left is the website for the program. On that website, up in the top right-hand corner, there is a link to the application. Generally, we are going to be looking for involvement of lots of different stakeholders, including the people who house the community response plan. So that's generally emergency management or first responders. It does not mean a hospital system can't start the process and get people involved, but we do want that. We need that piece because they're the ones who hold the plan. So that is on that website, as well as lots of other resources on the website. The QR code that you see actually will take you directly, if you hold your phone over that, it will take you directly to the application. And so you can fill out that application and hit submit, and it comes right to the program. And the program will look at relationship development, writing and exercising your plan, helping you with resources, helping to facilitate sort of this whole process across the board, and using subject matter experts as we do that. So people who have been on the ground, people who know what they're doing. So at this point, that's all we have. I would like to thank Carol and Karina, and again, direct you guys to all of the different ways that you can get in contact with us if you need to. And we thank you for your time today.